All right, friends, thanks for joining me for another episode of the new Evangelicals Podcast. Today, I'm just going to give everyone a heads up for a trigger warning. The conversation might get a little serious regarding sexual abuse, but I do have Eric from the Preacher Boys on my show today. Eric, thanks for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So I want to start here. I mean, I know we're going to get into a bunch of different things, but why don't you give us your background? How did you grow up? You know, was it in the Christian circles, non-Christian circles? And from there, we'll launch into what you do and all that stuff.
I grew up hardcore Christian circles. So I was born and raised in the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, or for anyone who follows my page, IFB for short. It gets a little mouthy trying to do Independent Fundamental Baptist every time we talk about it, but it is different. You know, a lot of people are familiar with the Southern Baptist, maybe American Baptist, and the Independent Baptist name is confusing because it's a little bit of a misnomer. So the term independent implies that they're all kind of on their own. They're these little solo isolated Baptist churches, but really it is a denomination unto itself. It's a movement. So you've got instead of having like a convention like the Southern Baptist Convention, it really is just a group of really like-minded kind of fundamentalist churches that are more closely connected to the Bible colleges that the pastors go to. So it is its own thing. They don't affiliate with SBC, American Baptist. They would say we're proud to be independent Baptist, but they'll go to conferences as a group and celebrate their independence. So it's a very odd kind of setup, but it's a very weird thing. So most groups are kind of triangular. You've got your leader and then you've got all these subgroups. There's a lot of those triangles in these circles. So you have Bob Jones University, you have Pensacola Christian College, West Coast Baptist College, Golden State, and then Hyles-Anderson. Those are kind of the big colleges. And then you have these little groups of churches that all come out of these kind of educational, if you can use that word loosely, educational kind of places. So I grew up in kind of a mix of a couple circles. So I grew up in a mix of the West Coast, Hyles-Anderson kind of college circles. So we were a little bit looser than the majority, and I always say my experience was relatively tame, but it was something where I grew up in that movement. My parents were on staff. I was hardcore, you know, King James only, you know, 3 times a week going to church, you know, rocking the suit every Sunday from the time I was a little kid up through. And it wasn't honestly till about 11th grade when my bubble kind of burst. I was all in. I didn't notice anything wrong. Now, in retrospect, I see a lot of things I wouldn't agree with. But it was a safe bubble, and we were very much separated. That's one of the doctrines of the IFB is the doctrine of separation. We were separated from the world, separated from other denominations. We were this safe little island. And around 11th grade, we had a sexual predator actually get shuffled to our church. And literally just by chance, I knew him through our basketball league. I Googled his name and found out all of this information about him. And long story short, I spent the next 2 years trying to get someone to like pay attention and go like, hey, this is a big deal. And I kind of just got pushed out to the side, and he's still there leading music to this day.
Get out of here. Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild story. So I spent the last 2 years trying to get people to really pay attention to it. And because I got kind of hush, you know, moved to the side, I really started just researching the movement because I was shocked that this would happen within my denomination, my safe bubble. And ended up finding out that there was a ton of this stuff within the Independent Baptist movement, and cover up was kind of the modus operandi kind of thing. So I can go a lot of different directions with that, but it was kind of a jarring thing. And I always say you've heard the 6 degrees or 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Yes, like, of course.
It literally felt like that with like sex offenders. Like it felt like, we talk about the Catholic Church. Like this feels very similar, and it's a much smaller kind of group. So
how did that affect your faith? I mean, so I grew up not in the IFB, but I did grow up in a Baptist kind of flavor, suit since I was a kid. A lot of those things do ring somewhat true. Pretty fundamentalist as well, how to separate from the world, but again, nothing official on paper. So I get a lot of that safe space feeling. Your friends are there. Now you're in 11th grade. You're starting to think for yourself. This happens. What happens to your faith during this time?
Yeah, I was really so for me, it wasn't like we were a flavor of Christianity or we were a brand, like we were the true Christianity. So
Mm,
like we were our like
hmm.
we had it. And then
Yeah.
there was like the skater church down the road, and there's like the
Right.
Southern Baptist church that like they're kind of okay, they should be okay, but their
Right.
music is a little crazy.
Right.
Or they're Calvinistic, like there was we were the ones that were right. This was Christianity. This was
Mm,
the church. And I didn't know John McCarthy. Like I didn't know those other names. I knew Paul Chappell and like my circle.
hmm.
And so when this initially happened, it never shook my faith in the sense of I've never been at a point where I could say like, oh, I don't believe in God. Because I was too, I still like, I'm just like, I'm too convinced of it. I can't
Right.
not see that.
Right.
But for me, the institution of the church, what
Yeah.
I thought was big C, I was like, I
Mm,
don't want anything to do with this.
hmm. Hmm.
But yeah, when I was graduating, I was like, I'll go to my 1 year Bible college, appease everybody. I'll go live somewhere far away where no one's going to even ask if I'm going to a church. Like I was pretty much done
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, long story short, I ended up taking an internship that was connected to a church. It was a media internship. And
Hmm.
so I ended up going, thank goodness I didn't go to one of the Bible colleges that I was going to go to. I think
Yeah.
that would have driven a nail in my faith. And I think it would have just destroyed me as a person. I think it would have
Yeah.
really crushed me. Um, I ended up going somewhere that was just thankfully a very, very gracious, amazing place. And if I hadn't done that, I don't know where my faith would be now. But
Right.
getting out on my own and getting out of that movement was
Yeah.
like it was getting an oxygen mask put on me. Like I felt like I was
Right.
experiencing real,
Mm,
authentic faith and grace for the
yeah.
first time.
Wow. So you left it and now you're kind of back in it, but with a whole different perspective, obviously. So what brought you back to make, it seems like at least on social media, your presence is really focused on calling out abuse in the IFB. That's a very specific thing. It seems like you're very committed to it. So what was the turning point where you said, I've got to go all the way with this and this is a big problem that must be called out?
So I left the IFB when I graduated. I mean, really, when I graduated high school, I pretty much left. I went back in it for a stint. I mean, I worked for an IFB organization, but I wasn't personally bought into that message.
Uh-huh. I get that.
I was bought into helping orphans and bought into and the
Yep.
guys I was working with at the time, I thought were very different than the people I had kind of known or researched.
Aha.
Ended up
Uh-huh.
finding out they were they were involved in a lot of similar,
Hmm.
not sex abuse stuff, but a lot of other, financial things and all that kind of stuff. I've had a
Wow.
rocky journey for my short life,
Yeah,
but
you're not
um
kidding.
yeah, I ended up I worked with a guy, total narcissist,
Mm.
was paying himself, $15,000 a month and paying me $500 a month, like crazy, crazy stuff.
Oh my
And
goodness.
ended up leaving that. That was kind of my last, it was kind of the death blow to me being any adjacency to that.
Mm.
And what ended up making me decide to become vocal about the independent Baptist movement, and not just, I was talking with Sarah Edmondson on my show the other day, and we talk about the moment where you leave silently or you blow it up.
Yeah.
And
Right.
for me, the decision to blow it up was when in 2019, there was a guy named Cameron Giovanelli. He worked at one of the colleges, and it came out that he had a relationship with a, I think 15 or 16-year-old girl at one of the churches, opened up a
Oh.
phone line for her on the church plan. Like
Whoa.
it was awful. But that happened. But then what happened to push me to speak out was there were literally pastors within the movement. Again, they act uniform in a lot of ways. They were raising money for his legal fees. They were writing articles slamming the victim. They were literally like, there was church letterhead with like fundraising for him after he pled guilty. And there was an article written by one of the evangelists in the circle saying, a lot of guilty pleas are out of plea bargaining. So, you can't even trust a confession. And it was like, man, are we really going to do this? And so that just prompted me. I pulled over in my car at our old apartment, and I recorded a 7-minute video just kind of laying out what I felt about the movement, and said, if you're connected to this person, this person, this person, all these people that have spoken against the victim, like, you need to get out of your church, like, right now. Like, if they're not going to cancel the ties, you need to leave. And
Wow.
Yeah, that was kind of the start of it. And then a few days later, I kind of kicked my butt in gear to start doing a little bit more. So
As you're saying that, for those who aren't, watching this, my jaw was literally dropped. I couldn't believe that story. How long ago was that? Was that recent?
yeah, that was 2019. So that
Okay.
was literally there
Wow.
was so I graduated in 2013. So
Okay.
for 7 years, I kept saying, someday someone's going to do a documentary, or I'm going to do a documentary, or I'll do a story about it, or there'll be a big new, like, I was like, this is huge. Like, this is big stuff. It'll get the Catholic Church treatment that, Spotlight did. And, my wife got to a point, she's like, you need to just do it, or just like stop talking about it. Like,
Yeah.
you'll
Right.
just keep saying you're going to do something.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I get that.
that story that reminded me so much of what I had seen then kind of pushed me to go like, okay, no one's going to do it unless I just do it. Like, no one's
Yeah.
going to focus on it with the same intensity and passion that I feel. There were some amazing reporters that have done one-off stories, but it doesn't pay their bills to focus on this day in, day out,
Right.
the way that I have.
I'm wondering kind of out loud here. I wonder why, because I'll be honest, I follow you on Instagram. I see what you post and I think, how is this not blowing up? And the thing is too, you share direct clips of them saying things that
Mhm.
are clearly
Yeah.
evil. I mean, there's no other word to say, evil. And I think, okay, this will get like a million billion shares. And it doesn't for whatever reason. But what I'm wondering is, do you think part of the reason why the IFB has flown under the radar is because in the evangelical circle, they're kind of under the radar? I mean, I've heard of Pensacola, I've heard of Bob Jones. Is Steven Anderson one of those dudes? Is he IFB, the
Yes,
real crazy guy?
Steven Anderson calls himself new IFB. So the IFB
God,
wasn't
that's
extreme
scary.
enough, so he jumped out. So yeah, but he's from one of those colleges. Like, he went to Hyles Anderson College and left. And what's crazy is like, if
Wow.
you look at there was just a pastors conference, again, pastors in quotation marks for
Right.
audio listeners, that
Right.
just met in Southern California. But if you listen to what they're saying from the pulpit and what Steven Anderson says, like, they may like it's a very thin line between
Mm,
his rhetoric and theirs. They just might be a little bit more polished, but you've heard the clips. It's not much more.
no,
It's
it's
not
really
very
not.
political, or
Right.
diplomatic.
And
So
so I'm wondering if that is why. I almost wonder, and this is just pure speculation, if like the SBC or whoever sees these guys and goes, well, no one really knows about them on like a grand level. And so we're not going to
mhm.
touch that because we know once that rock is churned over, it's going to explode. Do you
Yeah,
think that that's part of it, or am I just misinformed? Do you think?
I think about it a lot. I mean, I think about, because I had someone message me that said this happened at my church and I left over it, but I haven't seen the news do anything about it.
Right.
I think honestly, the biggest reason, because the Southern Baptist Convention's dealing with their own mess right now. I mean,
Yes.
they have
Totally.
Rachel Denhollander and all that, just rightfully so breathing down their necks, and and then you've got other evangelicalisms dealing with the Ravi thing, the
Yep.
Ravi
Yep.
Zacharias case. Um, it I don't know what the reason is that other denominations don't look. I think they're all focused on their own issues. I think the reason the news doesn't is because it is a very hard thing, if you're outside of it, to understand how it's connected. Because again,
Yes.
to the average person, if you see Independent Baptist Church, you're going, "Oh, this lone wolf,
Right.
is over here."
Right.
But if you're inside of it, you start seeing, like, literally there's a legal ministry that helps all of these churches with these cases. Like, there's a huge story here with
Oh
lots
my
of
gosh.
threads. But how does a reporter from the New York Times or HuffPost sit, or whatever organization you put in, sit down
Right.
and go, okay, the Catholic Church was like shooting fish in a barrel, because it's like, okay,
Right.
this leader knew, so that means this leader knew,
Yep.
and this leader knew, and does the Pope know? Like, that's,
Exactly.
but with the IFB, there's no Pope, there's no
Yes.
government,
Right.
and when they need to bond together for a conference, they'll join together. But when the light comes on to say what's going on with abuse, they'll say, "Oh, we're independent. What are you talking about? We're independent
Right.
churches."
Right. No
It's a
connection.
very tricky thing. Yeah, it
Mm.
has to be ex-members talking about it, or else it's just not. And I think we're on the brink of this getting some real attention, and I can talk to you off mic about it. I think
Sure.
we're on the brink of some of that stuff, but it had to start the way that it has, which is ex-members, like the ones that come on my show, sharing what happened and matching up. Here's what happened in California. Here's what happened in Florida. here's what's happened all over the place. It's all the same with the same players involved. So
Yes, well, I remember you sharing, and I'm sure you'll be able to fill in the gaps here, a story of a pastor who molested a 9-year-old, and I think then was moved to a different church that was uncovered like years later. Now, I'm pretty sure I read that on your site, but I also read stories that are very similar to that, where it's like you said earlier, this
yeah.
person molested someone and then they kept it quiet and then they moved them to a different church. And in this story,
Mhm.
the congregation had no idea that pastor did
Yeah.
that until it was like 7 or 8 years later on. Is that kind of
Yeah.
like one of like the MOs that you're seeing happening in the IFB
Yeah.
as far as how they actually cover up the abuse?
Yeah, so the word that gets used a lot is restoration. Like that term. That term
Hold
gets
me
used a
back,
lot,
Eric. Hold me back.
and
Oh man.
and it is you see a lot of these organizations where they don't want to destroy, and I'm using their words, don't want
Yes.
to destroy his life over a mistake. We want to look at the good and not throw that away because of the bad. And so we want to work and send him somewhere where he can get better and be restored. That's the kind of terminology that's always used. And so
Wow.
what happens is that you see, hey, I'm a pastor. He obviously can't stay in my church. Some churches, they will just let them stay, and the victim, they wait and let the victim go. But
Oh my
they'll
God.
say, okay, you can go to my buddy's church who, does this. Or a more extreme example, sometimes they'll send them to a restoration ministry, which one of the restoration ministries, Fall and Grace Ministries, is ran by a man who's been credibly accused multiple times of rape himself. So you literally have the blind leading the blind. The person who runs that ministry, if I can digress just a bit to show you kind of the extremity of this,
Go for it.
is David Hiles, whose father, Jack Hiles, if you Google him, he was like one of the founders of the IFB as we know it today.
Okay.
He was credibly accused of rape by two women at the college where he was working, his dad's college and church. He ended up going and getting to take a pastoral position at a church in Texas,
Okay.
where he had affairs with 19 different women within the church. A janitor ended up finding, I forget if this was at the church in Texas or First Baptist, but one of the churches he was at, a janitor ended up finding a briefcase in the dumpster full of like porn and swinger magazines that him and his wife had, put ads in and had taken pictures and put in the magazine. He then left there. He went to a church in Florida, had an affair with the secretary there. She was busted in a prostitution ring a few weeks or months
Oh
later,
my
and
God.
had a tattoo of his name on her thigh. That guy, this guy. Oh, and there was also, if you, again, David Hiles, like if you look, um, one of his children had multiple broken bones as like a less than 2-year old. The district attorney said it was an open and shut abuse case. The child did end up passing.
Oh
He
my
pled the
God.
fifth. He pled the fifth. They had another child, ended up running that child over with the car, said that was an accident. All this stuff, it just like this guy's story is like it could be an HBO series. Like it's so many layers. He's the guy running a restoration ministry out of Florida and helping fallen pastors, quote unquote, fallen pastors be restored. If that guy is still being heralded by pastors as some hero and being funded by churches, like when you look at a guy who's like, oh, he just molested one person, in the
Right.
grand scheme of things in that movement, he doesn't seem like that big a deal.
Right.
But the reality is, like, this happens over and over again. Yes, there are good ones in that movement, but those are the ones that are truly independent. The ones that are part of the organizations, I'm like, what's the excuse to stay? Like what are you gaining from this relationship where it's worth being connected with guys involved in this stuff? And it's not the fringe. That's the important thing. If and
Hmm.
I'll be quiet, I swear, but this is the thing that
No.
I hope everybody gets. This is not the fringe of the IFB.
Hmm.
Like, I have these kind of stories for the heads, like the main leaders of the biggest colleges within the movement. It's not the one-off oh, here's a parish kind of situation where this parish is corrupt. That's really what happened with the Catholic Church. Is there were parishes that were infiltrated with a lot of predators,
Yeah.
and the system allowed them to thrive.
Mm.
Again, not excusing Catholic Church, but I'm saying it
Right.
was parish by parish. Like the one in
Right.
San Diego does a great job pushing back on sex abuse and helps abuse victims in a huge way.
Right.
But then you go to a place like Boston, and it ran rampant.
Right.
The IFB, it's like literally you have all these little popes, and it's starting from
Right.
them down.
Wow.
And that's a really scary situation.
Yeah. When you mentioned about the child abuse, honestly, I have a 9-month-old, and like the thought of that,
Mhm.
it makes me want to cry and throw my computer at the same exact time, of how someone can be, especially claiming to be someone who represents God in a leadership position, like a pastor position, can
Yeah,
do that and live with themselves, frankly.
yeah,
Man, it's so hard to even know where to even go from here, because it literally, like you said, it's like an HBO series. It almost sounds larger than life, right? Like you hear that information, you go, you cannot be serious. And obviously there is,
yeah.
yes, we are serious. Like this is real stuff. So why do you, my question kind of maybe for next, for us to talk about is, it seems like this is more often commonplace in churches than we want to admit, frankly. And in the IFB, it seems like it's really
Yeah.
running rampant. The Ravi Zacharias, obviously, abuse came out. I listened to your interview with what's the guy's name who did the story on him?
With Steve Baughman. Yeah.
Yeah, really
Steve
well
Baughman.
done. Yeah, really great. I appreciated his posture too. It was so good. And so this happens, and then we go, oh, well, that's a shame. And then we just kind of move on. Like the system doesn't change. What do you think is causing, like, okay, my question is, do you think in your estimation, is it like a system is creating these people, or is it people, individuals who are just evil, who are finding a place in these systems and corrupting them, like chicken or the egg kind of thing? What's your
Yeah.
perspective on this?
It's a good question. And there's a lot of really good books on the why, like why does this happen?
Right.
But I kind of echo. I had Jimmy Hinton, which I definitely recommend his interview to your listeners. Jimmy Hinton's interview with me. He reported his own father. He's Church of
I listened to
Christ.
that one. It was amazing. That
Yeah,
was an amazing interview.
and yeah, I echo his sentiment in the sense of, he says you could try to figure out the why, but at the end of the day, who cares why they do what they do? At the
Hmm.
end of the day, it happens, and how do we identify it and prevent it? And I echo that in a lot of ways, in the sense of,
Yeah.
look, for people who do this, there's something egregiously wrong. Like there's something deeply, deeply, deeply wrong
Yeah.
with them. And I'm not comfortable excusing it away as a mental illness, or as
Mm-hmm.
there's just something deeply, deeply wrong.
Right.
And the science does not show that people who do this stuff change. I've yet to see a case where
Hmm.
that has happened. All that to say, I think when you talk about the church system and why it happens, whether you're looking at Ravi Zacharias, whether you're looking at Carl Lentz, whether you're looking at, Bill Hybels,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
more verbal abuse like a Mark Driscoll,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
any of these cases, especially within the IFB, I think it all goes back to the same problem. In the IFB, we call the pastors the men of God. That's the label. It's
Yep.
the man of God, and or the MOG, the MOG.
Right.
And so that's the terminology. I always joke you could take away the man of, and it's probably a more apt descriptor of how much
Mm.
power that they have.
Yeah.
But if you look at all these cases, it's power unchecked.
Yeah.
Any abuse situation is a result of power being completely unchecked. We tend to think about it when we think of let's just say sexual assault, because that's the majority of what I deal with.
Right.
When you look at sexual assault, you tend to think about someone overpowering someone physically.
Right.
So you when you hear that Ravi Zacharias, did this, you're going, he's this like kind of, he's tall, but he's kind of like an older man. Like you can't
Right.
imagine this. But then
Right.
imagine extremely wealthy, is traveling constantly, has personal assistants, has apparently a lot of money to spend on whatever he wants to,
Right.
opens up a ministry to pay for his own masseuse to travel with him wherever he goes.
Yep.
Like that's unchecked power. Like and when you look at these cases, there always is a person who's in a position where they are not questioned, they're not
Hmm.
held accountable. There's no, I mentioned the pastor earlier. that sparked me actually launching the show. He opened up a cell phone line on the church's plan for the girl involved. Like, how did nobody at the church have access to that information and see that? So,
Right.
and again, it's totally on them, but like, is the system giving a blank check to a person to do whatever they want to do? And I
Right.
think when you venerate a person to such a high level that they can't be questioned,
Right.
then narcissists and sex offenders and abusers are like, they're like gnats to a light bulb. Like, they're like, I
Yeah.
have to get to that position.
Right.
And so when it comes to is the church creating sexual abusers? I don't, I don't think so, because there's a lot of people that go to church that don't end up that
Right.
way.
Right.
But do a lot of abusers use the path of religion because it's a path of least resistance? I think that's 100% provable.
Mm.
And I'll give I'll give 3 book examples. Why not? I have
Sure.
more
Go
show
for it.
notes for you.
Great.
But I would say the book Predators by I'm blanking on the name, but it's called Predators. That book is a absolutely fantastic look at what drives predators and what they look for. When Narcissism Comes to Church by Chuck DeGroat
Mm.
is another great example, and it kind of explains how the narcissistic tendencies can look like great benefits. Like, it can look like strong leadership, it can look like a good communicator, it can look like confidence, but it's
Huh.
actually narcissism in disguise.
Wow.
And then the other example I would give would be Pray Tell. It's a new book. I don't even know if it's actually released yet. It might come out later this month, by Tiffany Bloom. I had her on my show as well. And that book
Yeah.
is a phenomenal, really digestible book to read that kind of explains that. So,
Yeah, I tend to feel what you're feeling, and agreeing with you in a lot of those ways. It makes you wonder, though. I mean, I don't want to go too far down this path, if we don't need to. But something I'm passionate about is like rethinking like the church that we have in America,
mhm.
right? Like the American Evangelical
Right.
Church, and like the system that is set up. It really becomes a safe space, like you said, for people like that, because what could look like a good quality leadership, which the church is like just drooling over these days. There's so many books on leadership, how to lead well, and good communicators, which is like, who wants to be the next Stephen Furtick, right? Who wants to have their videos go viral? That
Who's gonna have satellite campuses and
Yes,
grow a mega church? Yeah.
exactly, right? And it makes you wonder. I just feel like the system that we've built, that we call church, is unhealthy in a lot of ways, and this is one of like the worst ways. Is that it's become
Mhm.
a way to harbor people who can get away with abusing people. And this isn't, we're not talking about a guy has an affair with someone else and it's consensual and they made a mistake. Like that's one type of issue, right? There's trust broken with the spouse.
Yeah.
This is sexual abuse. It's a totally different ball game than just, oh, like, my wife and I weren't doing too well. I slept with this person and it was a big mistake and it was consensual. This is, there's power dynamics here. There's manipulation
Yeah.
dynamics here. And so it's all that more heinous because you're really robbing someone of their humanity. So I do
Right.
wonder a lot if, I don't know. I just wonder personally how much longer this system can keep up with the way it's set up before it really comes in a big, horrible way crashing down. I just don't know.
Well, there's actually 2 things there that just come to mind, and I kind of want to actually backtrack a little bit to,
Sure.
because I said that, do I think the church is creating the abusers? I said I don't think so. So I think there's actually a layer to that where the way that we teach about sexuality, I think, does
Mm,
teach harmful. I don't think that it necessarily, well, it probably does. I think it does, if you follow it to the T, does create
yep.
abusers, in
Mm,
the sense of, when we teach that men are not responsible for their own actions, like, again and again, this is, yes, women can be abusers too, but we'll just take it to men.
yes.
When you look at purity culture, where
Yep.
you've got you look at a guy and say, women dress this way so you don't cause a man to lust, versus a man saying, like, I'm not going to look at women as objects.
Right.
That is creating, that's rape culture, like,
Yep.
that is kind of by definition. And so in that sense, I would say the church and the way it teaches can lead to this kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
I think most people, the reason that not everybody does it, I think, is because they let that roll off their back or they don't really follow it to the letter of like the logical extent of that. But
Mm-hmm.
that teaching does. The shooting that just happened in Georgia,
Yep. Yes.
the guy who did that, he said he told the police, and again, total psychopath, told the police that he was trying to rid himself of sexual temptation.
Right.
And Rachel Denhollander had an amazing tweet about it and just saying like this stems from like he was going to a Baptist, church, and she's
Yep.
like,
Yep.
if you look at this teaching that says like women are responsible for you,
Right.
and what you're thinking, this is kind of the extreme. Yes, not everyone's going to grab a gun and go shoot somebody,
Right.
but again, if you have sex with someone before marriage and your purity's ruined, you're
Yep.
again, quote unquote, you're going to go after the woman for tempting you.
That's
You're going
right.
to go out. So that is a super harmful thing. And then the other thing I wanted to say, and a good book for that is Rachel Welcher's book, Talking Back to Purity Culture, is a really, really good book. The other thing I wanted to say too is about the consent thing, because yes, an affair or something, you look at a lot of these cases and you say, if they were a CEO, what's the big deal? But it's because they're a pastor, it makes it a little bit worse. But I also kind of think even the relationships that are consensual, quote unquote, when you have the amount of power that these men of God are given, how consensual can something be? You know what I mean? And again, there are cases where, it is two people that, they do. And again,
Right.
the church can deal with that. However, but
Right.
when it comes to a youth pastor and teenage girl, obviously it's wrong, but you've got the manipulation, but you also have even a pastor, like you look at I'm trying to think of an example, because Carl Lentz didn't share he was a pastor, so it was actually one of the few where it's not the case. Falwell, we'll take Falwell for example.
There we go.
Take someone with Falwell's position.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like, this is the president of Liberty University, which is pretty well known even beyond the Christian world. Like
Totally.
they've established themselves as a pretty huge place.
Right.
How much of a power imbalance is there? Is he physically imposing? Maybe not, but like he has unlimited money, resources.
Yep.
Ravi Zacharias, another good example. Unlimited money, resources, tens of millions of dollars every year going to these ministries. Are you going to be the person to blow the whistle on that?
Right.
Because Lori Ann Thompson tried blowing the whistle on that, and she got slapped with an NDA and a bunch of legal
and church
fiascos.
Culture really threw her out, right? I mean, church culture overall said, and now listen, I mean, full disclosure, in a sense, I was kind of one of those people. I remember this story coming out and I'm like, oh, that's crazy. Oh, well, they did a quote unquote investigation. There's an NDA. I guess it never really happened. I kind of almost blocked it off because I was such a big believer in Ravi at the time. And so it's easy just to believe the one in power as well, right? Like it's easy for the person who has the ministry, who's trying to save souls. It's easy
and you have history with them.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
you're going, man, he's the reason I believe in God, or he's the reason that I believe in, this, or he's the reason, some of these pastors, like, he's the one that married us. Like, this is the pastor in our church that married us. This is my youth pastor. Like, this is the person who pastored my parents before me. I grew up in Sunday school. Like,
exactly.
There's so much baggage, even especially with these high profile leaders. Like, who wants to believe that Ravi Zacharias, who we shared all these viral clips from, do you lock your doors at night? Like, that clip's been shared like millions and millions of times.
Right.
Like, we don't want to believe that guy, like that bastion of righteousness, is doing this.
Right.
But we've set ourselves up to crumble because we have put all our faith in the man, Ravi, as opposed to, get all super spiritual on you instead of like the God man, Jesus. Like, that's literally the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
But
You're
anyway,
exactly
not to
right.
cut you off.
And no, you're totally fine. And that is like another form of power, right? Like you don't even realize it, but when I was going through hard times through anxiety, depression, I listened to Ravi's stuff, his just thinking stuff. And I was like, wow, this is so helpful. So, and I would never say this in the sense of that I really was hurt by what happened, with Ravi, because clearly like I wasn't hurt at all, but it did kind of sting mentally, right? Of like, oh man, like I almost feel kind of betrayed in a really roundabout way. So I'm with you all the way on that. Let's talk about you're currently working on a documentary. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like anything, COVID has been a amazing thing. So, basically beginning of the year that I started the podcast, the original goal was just the documentary, and it looked like I was going to be shooting that in the summer of 2020.
Okay.
Obviously, I went to Florida for a convention, and I
Right.
came back, and the world was shut down.
Right.
I thought it was going to open back up, ended up canceling it. I've had, there's been a lot of really interesting things that have happened the last 2 years. It will happen. It's just been on pause, and honestly, the podcast, which was the afterthought, it was like, oh, I have way too many people coming to me. I have to do more to be able to hear all those stories.
Yeah.
It's really become a full-time. I say that, and I don't think people get it, but like, it really is a full-time job. Like it's very consuming. And so, as time goes on, I think the documentary has shifted, and I think what it will be. But it will still happen at some point. It's going to be when things are back to being semi-normal, which I don't even want to say it'll be in the next few months, because it'll just jinx it again. But
well, your
yeah,
podcast seems to have taken off though, big time. I mean, I think that you shared a stat a couple weeks ago. I think it's like over 100,000 downloads, right? It's like several 100,000.
It's like 330,000 last time, which was like the beginning of the month. It's wild. Like again, I started as an afterthought. Like I thought, okay, when I announced the documentary, I had like 30 people reach out like the next day. And I was like, okay, I have to do a show to like just talk to everybody.
Totally.
But now it's at a point like, I mean, it's like 40,000 downloads a month, just all these people. And they're people who, this is what kind of proves the thesis of the show, is like all those people relate to the stories that are being shared, and they're from all over the United States. Like it's pretty much all within the US. There's people from Florida, Texas, Illinois, like they all resonate with the stories being shared.
Wow.
And now it's gone, with some of the guests that have been on, now it's expanding to where, yes, I'm still staying in the IFB. I'll occasionally talk about just, because abuse is abuse everywhere. I'll talk with people from other denominations, groups. So I have Catholics that listen now, Mormon, like I have people that resonate with some part. It's like a Venn diagram. You've got like, like I resonate with the church abuse. I resonate with just the abuse. I resonate with like this angle. And like, so it's really just become its own thing. And the treadmill's moving faster, and I'm like one person running to keep up with it pretty much.
I get it. I mean, I think though it's clear. I don't know of any other podcasts off the top of my head I've encountered that like are dedicated to really exposing sex abuse in not only the IFB, but really, I mean, you have the potential to expand into the evangelical circles as a whole. You know, I'm sure you see what like Do Better Church does on Instagram. They have a whole account dedicated to letting victors speak. But I think your podcast is just such an amazing place to be able to have this conversation that for so many of us, we're like, yes, like this is problematic. And it is ironic that so many of us who are dedicated Jesus people are often maligned as like being divisive, quote unquote, or harmful, when all we're trying to do is to make the church healthier by getting rid of abuse. It makes no sense.
Yeah, there's a few really good accounts. Like Julie Royce has a good podcast, and she does some good reporting and things like that. But yeah, with the abuse side, I mean, it's largely social media and things like that, and which is good. I mean, like I wish I had the social impact that some of these accounts have,
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, it has to be talked about. And yeah, it's hilarious to me. I mean, I get some interesting reviews. I tend to share them, bathing in toilet water, or like bitter, can't take preaching and all this stuff. And the funny thing is, I think people would be surprised how orthodox I am, like that actually listen to the show or talk to me, is that I'm a very orthodox, pretty traditional Christian in most ways, like theologically speaking. But I did a post with Beth Allison Barr talking about her book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And I shared that I went from being like literally in the last like year, I went from like complementarian to egalitarian. And I had people going like, I knew this was why you were starting, is you're trying to lure people into liberalism, and your pendulum is swinging this way. I was like, dude, I'm pretty sure I'm a literal like 7-day like creation. Like I'm pretty sure I'm still in that realm. Like I'm super tradition. Like, and it's just really, it's just really funny that that's the kind of takeaway. But again, I think that's kind of where you should be, right? Is like the I said the Christian story, like I'm like I'm so like the Christian story is really, but like the biblical narrative
Yes.
is very, very, very clear on the gospel and on who Jesus is. And it's like, theologically speaking, could not be more clear on those things. But the Bible is also very vague on a lot of, like, on end time stuff,
Totally.
on creation. And so for me, I'm like, man, none of us are going to agree on any of this, because we're all interpreting a lot of this for ourselves. And so it's one of those things where I kind of laugh, because I'm like, man, I'm okay not fitting in 100% with any of these groups, because I'm just convinced, like the egalitarian thing, like I don't have an agenda. I don't care. It was frustrating to me, like, to even say it, because I knew people were going to shoot at me. And it's like, but I'm convinced. She convinced me with a good argument and with good reasoning. So there I am. And there's other things that, like even she's posted that I'm like, I'm not on board with that really, or like that idea, but okay, who cares? We're the same. Are we the same on this, or are we both on a baseline? Are we both human beings? So yeah, we can sit and have a conversation and exist.
That's really the question is, I think for a lot of people on my account, for me as well, coming out of some form of fundamentalism with some John MacArthur reformed in there, it would.
I got a little bit of that too.
Yeah. Who doesn't, right?
Okay, that's a whole another podcast.
It really is. But I came out of it, and one of my points that I say a lot to people who are in those more like fundamentalist camps is that, listen, I'm not asking you to change your theology. I'm just asking you to make room for mine. That's all I'm asking. Like, can we just have some room at this table? Can we let people who don't see it the same way sit at the table and have their voices heard and respectfully dialogue and share our agreements and disagreements? That's a very different conversation than I'm trying to convert the reformed person out of their reformed theology, right? Because you said, I get it. I get how people can see the Bible a certain way. I get how people can get this theology, but there's not a lot of like room made for anything outside of what people deem orthodox. And then they insult you with the liberal slur. Like that is like the trump card, right? Yeah. Like when all else fails, just call them a liberal. It's like, guys,
it's literally the trump card.
It is. I mean, but it just shows the lack of critical thinking. But anyway, that's for a whole different discussion, because I very much resonate with what you're saying. And I think you'll find as you continue on, on the path that you're on, as well as me, that, like you and I can disagree on a lot of things, and we can still have common ground and still respect each other despite those disagreements, and still see each other as in the faith. Like, it's possible to do both at the same time. So I'm very much with you on that.
And even those, and even a level deeper, like even those outside of the faith, like the fact, I mean, I've had people that have been like, I've had people leave reviews or leave comments saying like, oh, you interviewed an atheist, or you did. I'm like, so is their story of abuse not valid, or do they not have anything that we can, And so like that's especially when you're dealing with the reform crowd, when you're like, okay, you want to wear shirts that say, Imago Dei on them and talk about people made in the image of God. But then you also want to say like, oh, you had some freak on your show who's like,
I know.
And they'll throw out LGBT slurs and things. It's like, man, can we just like sit down and have a conversation and respect the humanity in one another?
Right.
And it seems like that's a pretty core Christian principle. So
you would really think, but some of these accounts that you run into, you wonder like, okay, so this only means for your group. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, right? Yeah. It's like God is love for your group, and everyone else, he's wrath and judgment, right? So I'm a very big believer of not dehumanizing people, even the ones that we really don't like. I mean, I had a hard time with that with Trump, right? Like, how do I not dehumanize someone like Trump, who for me, it just grinds all my gears for all the right reasons. And it's like that is how we end that cycle of making someone the other, is by recognizing the humanity inside of them. So listen, I mean, Eric, it was great having you on the show, honestly. And I'm looking forward to see what you're going to be doing, down the line, especially with whenever the documentary is ready to go. But your podcast, if I could just encourage you, it's needed. And I'm sure it's a ton of work. I mean, I run a small podcast and it's a ton of work sometimes. And so I can only imagine when you have, things going on and a family, it can be a lot of work and sometimes even discouraging, but please keep going, because you're absolutely doing, I would say, God ordained essential work that the church needs to be aware of.
No, I really appreciate that. Yeah, the biggest thing is just time reading. Just reading a lot of authors on, so I've just been reading a ton of books.
Yes.
But yeah, it's been awesome, and I have a lot of really cool supporters on my side that are kind of helping make it possible. So but I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Where can people find you? Plug all of your stuff, YouTube, Instagram, whatever else we can find you. Go for it.
Yeah, definitely YouTube. Just search Preacher Boys, search Eric Skwarczynski. You're probably gonna have better luck searching Preacher Boys than that. So I'm over there. You can, I think it's Preacher Boys Doc, so
Yes.
preacherboysdoc.com/YouTube. The website is preacherboysdoc.com, so Preacher Boys DOC. And then all the social handles are at Preacher Boys Doc, again, DOC. And yeah, definitely go check it out. Really cool interview. I'm going to plug this because it's awesome.
Yeah, go
and
for it.
Everyone should go listen. But I actually interviewed someone outside the IFB. I interviewed Sarah Edmondson, who is in HBO's The Vow.
Oh,
You
shoot.
guys have checked that out.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
so
have.
it's
I've watched
pretty
that whole
amazing.
thing.
Yeah, so I just had her and Nippy, her husband, on, and so that's dropping next Wednesday, or I don't know when this drops, but it'll be Wednesday the 24th. So yeah, definitely, guys, go check that out. If for nothing else, that's probably a good spot. But yeah, keep an eye out, and if you like listening or watching or just reading, I probably have something for you. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Eric, for coming on. I really appreciate it.